It was meant to be an ordinary crossing, a short evening hop across the English Channel. Families, lorry drivers, and day trippers were settling into their seats, thinking about home or the weekend ahead. But just minutes after leaving the Belgian port of Zeebrugge, the Herald of Free Enterprise would be fighting for her life and losing. In less than 90 seconds, laughter turned into screams, light into darkness, and hope was replaced by horror. 193 lives would be claimed in a tragedy so swift, so avoidable, that it shook the very foundations of maritime safety forever. The English Channel and the rise of the roll-on, roll-off ferry. The English Channel, that thin stretch of water dividing England from continental Europe, looks deceptively small on a map. At its narrowest point, it can be swum. But the crossing between Dover and the French coast is still one of the busiest and most demanding shipping lanes in the world. For decades, ferries carried foot passengers eager to sample the streets of northern France or make a quick run to the continent for cheaper goods. Then, in the 1920s, the first car ferries appeared, allowing motorists to take their vehicles across with them. After the Second World War, demand exploded, and technology raced to keep pace. Gone were the days of cranes hoisting cars aboard one at a time. Purpose-built vessels emerged, designed so that drivers could roll straight on at one end and straight off at the other. The roll-on, roll-off ferry, the Ro-Ro, had arrived. It was fast, efficient, and enormously profitable. But beneath that efficiency lay a design truth that nobody in the industry wanted to dwell on for too long. A Ro-Ro ferry is essentially a vast hollow box. The vehicle deck that makes it so convenient also makes it uniquely vulnerable. Water, if it ever found its way inside that open space, had nowhere to go and nothing to stop it. For a time, that vulnerability stayed theoretical. Business was booming, the crossings were quick, and competition between operators was fierce. Speed and turnaround times mattered above almost everything else. Safety, it would later emerge, did not always make the same shortlist. Townsend Thoresen and the Herald of Free Enterprise. In the late 1970s, European Ferries plc ordered 3 modern roll-on, roll-off ferries for the fiercely competitive Dover to Calais route. Built in Germany, the spirit of free enterprise, the pride of free enterprise, and the Herald of Free Enterprise were designed for rapid acceleration and quick turnaround in port, hallmarks of the Townsend Thoresen brand. Launched in late 1979, the Herald was an 8-deck vessel capable of carrying 1,400 passengers and crewed by 80 men and women, working against the clock between every sailing. Beneath the waterline sat machinery, fuel tanks, and some passenger cabins. Above that, the main vehicle deck, G-deck, stretched the full length of the ship, swallowing lorries whole through bow doors at the front and a single large stern door at the rear. When those doors were sealed, they held the sea at bay. When they were open, the car deck was exposed directly to the water. There were no weather-tight bulkheads dividing the space, no internal barriers to slow or contain a flood. It was, by design, a single, enormous open cavern running from bow to stern. The bow doors were everything. And yet, by 1987, the Herald was operating without a single indicator light on the bridge to confirm whether they were open or closed. There was no alarm, no camera feed, and no direct line of sight from the wheelhouse to the bow. The only confirmation a captain ever received came from the crew member responsible for closing them. Captains had pushed for simple bridge indicators as far back as 1983. Management's response had been dismissive. The request came again in 1986. It was rejected again. The flaw was known. The fix was simple. And it was never made. On the evening of the 6th of March, 1987, a £1 ticket promotion run by the Sun newspaper had swelled passenger numbers beyond the usual Friday evening crowd, making the turnaround at Zeebrugge more hectic than it might otherwise have been. The already pressured crew were working harder and faster than normal. Among those boarding for the trip back to Dover were Michael and Maureen Bennett, with their daughter Teresa and her fiancé Mark, who had planned the crossing to celebrate her parents' wedding anniversary. Simon Osborne and his friends had spent their day on a bar crawl around Ostend and were now looking forward to getting home. Lorry drivers, as was customary, had been allocated cabins first, ensuring they could rest during the crossing. Exactly how many people were aboard that evening would later prove difficult to establish with certainty. Townsend Thoresen kept no complete passenger list. Vehicle registration numbers were noted, but only drivers' names were formally recorded. There was something else working against the Herald that night. Zeebrugge's link span ramp, the elevated bridge connecting the port to the ship's upper vehicle deck, wasn't long enough to reach E-deck at high tide. The workaround was standard practice for this route. The crew would flood the Herald's ballast tanks to lower the vessel until the ramp aligned properly. The problem was that draining those tanks again would take around 90 minutes, time the schedule simply did not allow. And so, on the evening of the 6th of March, the Herald prepared to leave Zeebrugge, sitting lower in the water than she was ever designed to sail. Nobody reversed the ballast. And that detail, quiet and unremarkable in the rush of a busy turnaround, would prove catastrophic. The chain that broke. At berth 12, the bow doors stood wide open as the last vehicles rolled aboard. The duty of closing them fell to Assistant Boatswain Mark Stanley. After supervising maintenance and cleaning work on the deck, Stanley had been released by Boatswain Terry Ayling and had returned to his cabin, where he fell asleep. He was not woken by the tannoy announcement calling crew to harbor stations. He remained on his bunk until the Herald began to capsize. First Officer Leslie Sable, whose responsibility it was to ensure the doors were shut before departure, had left the vehicle deck, believing he had seen Stanley heading back towards the bow. Or at least he thought he had seen someone in that area. It was a fatal assumption made in a moment of tired inattention, and Boatswain Terry Ayling, who had been nearby and was aware the doors were still open, had stretched a chain across the gap as a token barrier. Closing them, he would later insist, was not his responsibility. From the bridge, Captain David Lurie had no view of the bow. The ship's design made it physically impossible, and there were no indicator lights to tell him anything different. He had no reason to believe the doors were anything other than sealed shut. Assuming the departure routine had been completed as it always was, he ordered the Herald out of Zeebrugge, a harbor tug guiding her turn. Once clear, the ferry accelerated from 5 knots in the channel to 18 knots as she passed the outer mole, heading for Dover. The bow doors were wide open. The ballast tanks were still flooded, and the Herald of Free Enterprise was heading into shallow water at speed. What happened next took 90 seconds. That is all the time there was between an ordinary Friday evening crossing and one of the worst peacetime maritime disasters in British history. As the Herald accelerated through Zeebrugge's shallow harbor approaches, a phenomenon known as the squat effect took hold. The pressure drop beneath the moving hull pulled the vessel even lower into the water. The bow wave, normally harmless at lower speeds, began to surge upward as the ship gathered pace. In a later recreation using the Herald's sister ship, the Pride of Free Enterprise, investigators watched as that wave crested to 4 meters in height, driven upward by the combination of speed and shallow water. It was a force nobody on board the Herald that evening could see coming. At 1924, just clear of the outer mole, seawater surged through the open bow doors and spilled across the car deck. With no bulkheads to contain it, the free surface effect took over immediately. Water moving freely across an open deck shifts the vessel's center of gravity with devastating speed. The more the ship tilts, the faster the water runs to the low side. The more water runs to the low side, the faster the ship tilts. It is a feedback loop with only one possible outcome. 2 minutes after the first water entered, the Herald began to heel sharply to port, 30 degrees in seconds. On the bridge, Captain Lurie had time to shout, "What's going on here?" and to attempt an emergency stop before the ship rolled. He was thrown 40 feet from the starboard side of the bridge to the port side as the windows smashed inward and the freezing waters of the channel poured in. He later recalled that he tried to get back to the VHF radio but was unable to. He said he had been thrown across the bridge and must have blacked out, and that the next thing he knew, he was floating. She briefly righted herself before rolling again, this time fully onto her side. The entire capsize lasted barely 90 seconds. The Herald of Free Enterprise came to rest on a sandbank barely a kilometer from shore, saved from sinking completely by sheer fortune. Darkness, freezing water, and the fight to survive. Inside, chaos was instant and absolute. Water entered the engine room and knocked out both the main and backup electricity systems, plunging the ship into total darkness. Passengers were hurled through collapsing interiors. Walls became floors. Floors became walls. Furniture, equipment, and people tumbled together through the dark. Peter, who had been at the duty-free counter when the first jolt came, remembered it this way. "A woman behind me started screaming. I thought she was overreacting, and then a more violent jolt shook the ship and almost instantly she capsized. I slid across the lounge floor until I hit the bar, which had gone from vertical to horizontal. Everything not bolted down came crashing through the air. People were somersaulting from one side of the ship to the other. One man smashed through a glass panel just feet from me, and then the lights went out, and I was swept up by a freezing wave that smashed through the doors and windows. I thought I was going to die." In the freezing water, many drowned almost immediately. Others were crushed by falling fixtures and fittings. A glass partition in the cafeteria became a deadly barrier to those trying to escape, trapping passengers in a shrinking pocket of air. Michael Reynolds, who was among those trapped there, remembered with terrible clarity. There was no more than 18 inches of air, and I remember thinking, if we go any deeper, then that's it. Another passenger, desperate to break through the glass, dislocated every finger on his right hand trying to punch his way free. Teresa Bennett, whose family had boarded to celebrate her parents' anniversary, remembered the cruelty of an irony that made everything worse. The life jackets came down from above us, as if a cupboard or something had opened suddenly. There were so many of them that many people were having even more difficulty trying to find space to move. Everyone was tangled up in the straps. The very equipment meant to save lives was adding to the confusion and the terror. Outside, witnesses nearby quickly reported the sinking to port authorities. Helicopters, Navy craft, and local vessels were already converging on the scene. But inside the Herald, hundreds of people were trapped in darkness, clinging to air pockets in the freezing cold, praying that rescue would outrun the rising tide. The rescue. The response was immediate and brave. Within 15 minutes of the first distress call, 35 ambulances had lined the harbor. Red Cross workers waited with blankets. To avoid overwhelming any single hospital, the injured were sent by rotation to different medical centers across the region. Some of the Herald's own crew became the first rescuers on scene. Bosun Terry Ailing fought his way to the bridge where he found able seaman Tony D. and quartermaster Tom Wilson. Together, they lowered a line, hauling Captain Lurie, Chief Officer Leslie Sable, and Second Officer Paul Mortar to safety. From a lifeboat, they retrieved a flare and fired it to signal the approaching tugboats. Then they armed themselves with hammers, axes, and ropes, and went in search of survivors. A handful of passengers thrown onto the starboard deck as the ship rolled had scrambled onto the exposed hull, but most were still trapped inside. Ailing later recalled that he had to walk on the windows. It was like a scene out of a horror film. They were walking on people's faces while fists hammered at the windows. The rescuers signaled for those inside to move back, smashed the glass carefully to avoid showering the desperate faces on the other side, and began pulling people out one by one. About an hour after the capsize, the first rescue divers entered the ship, moving through debris and darkness to search for anyone still alive. Pete Lagasse later described that with the lights they saw people in the water who were moving, and also people who were motionless and had probably died. But they went for those who were moving, the ones who put up their arms or called out, because those people were still alive. Among those he pulled from the water was 14-year-old Nicola Simpson. She had spent 2.5 hours in the water beside her mother's body. Lagasse remembered that he lifted Nicola out 3 times and twice she slipped from him at the last moment. The third time he had to push her, step by step, up the ladder in front of him to make sure she would not fall back in. She was evacuated by helicopter, clinically dead. Through remarkable fortune and the hard work of the medical teams who received her, she was resuscitated and was later reunited with her father. Despite the growing darkness and the rising tide, the rescue went on long into the night. Almost 7 hours after the capsize, the last survivors, Brian Gibbons, Joe Sherwood, and Roger Broomfield, lorry drivers trapped in a cabin on H-deck, were located and winched to safety. By then, the temperature had dropped to around -5 degrees Celsius. Anyone still in the water had been fighting hypothermia for hours. For many, help had arrived too late. Heroes in the dark. Among the accounts of that terrible night, there were moments of courage so extraordinary that they stood apart even against the bleakest backdrop. Larry O'Brien braved the icy water and the chaos, pulling at least 30 people to safety despite being unable to swim himself. He went back in again and again. Michael Skippen, a head waiter, found himself trapped in the rapidly flooding restaurant. Rather than fight his way out, he stayed behind, helping others escape the submerged chaos one by one. His selfless actions cost him his life. Countless others owe their survival entirely to his courage in those final moments. And then there was Andrew Parker, who became known, simply and permanently, as the Human Bridge. When survivors were trapped on the Herald's hull, with no safe way across to a waiting tugboat, Parker lay himself down across the gap. One by one, people clambered over his body to safety. His own frame was the only link between life and the freezing water below. He was battered and bruised by the time the last person crossed. But he was alive, and so were they. 14 gallantry medals were presented to those who risked their own lives that night. It was, those who were there would later agree, a rare and genuine thing to watch so many strangers run toward danger when every instinct must have been screaming otherwise. The inquiry and the disease of sloppiness. The official inquiry was presided over by Justice Sheen, and his report did not mince its words. The captain and chief officer had their certificates suspended. All 3 deckhands, Stanley for abandoning his post, Sable for his fatal assumption, and Ailing for failing to report the open doors, were found to have played a part in the negligence. But the report went considerably further than apportioning individual blame. Justice Sheen found that the underlying cardinal faults lay much higher up in the company. The board of directors had not understood their own responsibility for safety. They had not, it appeared, even asked the most basic question: what orders should we give to keep our ships safe? From the boardroom down through every level of management, there had been no proper comprehension of duty. Repeated requests for simple bridge door indicator lights had been rejected without serious consideration. Communication between ship's crews and management had been poor to the point of being toxic, and the entire organization, in Justice Sheen's now famous phrase, was infected with the disease of sloppiness. That damning conclusion led to criminal charges. 7 company officials were charged with both gross negligence manslaughter and corporate manslaughter, in what became one of the first serious attempts in British legal history to hold a corporation criminally responsible for deaths caused by its own culture and conduct. But the case collapsed when the judge directed the jury to acquit. Nobody was ever held criminally responsible for the deaths of 193 people. In the months that followed, Townsend Thoresen was quietly rebranded as P&O Ferries. Its distinctive orange and white livery was repainted. The pride of free enterprise became the pride of Bruges. The spirit of free enterprise became the pride of Kent. New names on old hulls carried the weight of a history that no fresh coat of paint could ever fully cover. Out of the wreckage came change, real, lasting, and long overdue. The most obvious fix came first. Every ship of the Herald's type would now carry indicator lights on the bridge showing the exact status of the bow and stern doors. Closed-circuit television would back it up, giving officers a direct view from their posts without needing to trust that someone else had done their job. It was the simplest of solutions, the one that had been asked for and refused, twice, before the Herald was lost. The rescue had also exposed other deadly vulnerabilities. Too many passengers had been plunged into darkness when the power failed. Too many had struggled to put on life jackets in the chaos. Too many had been trapped behind toughened glass that rescuers had to smash from outside before anyone could escape. New standards addressed all of it. Movable barriers were added to vehicle decks to limit how far floodwater could travel. Scuppers and side vents were fitted to allow drainage. They would not make such ships unsinkable, but they could slow a flood and buy precious minutes. As the Herald had demonstrated in the most devastating way possible, minutes can mean the difference between survival and catastrophe. Dutch salvage specialists righted and refloated the Herald within days. A month later, the final bodies were recovered from her wreck. Towed to a shipyard near Zeebrugge, she was briefly put up for sale by her owners, who maintained she could sail again. No buyer came forward. By 1988, she was on her final voyage to a scrapyard in Taiwan, where the twisted steel was broken apart and melted down. A permanent memorial at St. Mary's Church in Dover honors those who lost their lives that night, standing as a lasting reminder that they will never be forgotten. The Herald of Free Enterprise did not sink in a storm. She was not struck by another vessel. She was not overwhelmed by some force beyond any reasonable human control. She capsized in calm water, close to shore, in fair weather, on an ordinary Friday evening, because a door was left open and nobody checked, because a request for a warning light was refused, because a company had built a culture in which complacency was not the exception but the standard. And 193 people, the youngest just 23 days old, never made it home. That is the truth of what happened on the 6th of March 1987. Not a mystery, not an unavoidable act of fate, a chain of small failures, any single link of which, broken at any point, could have saved them all. The sea, as those who sail it will always tell you, forgives no oversight. And every voyage, no matter how short or how familiar, depends entirely on the vigilance of those who set sail. Naturally, this was a deeply distressing story, and our condolences go out to the families and friends of all those who lost their lives. I hope you liked the way the material was presented. I look forward to seeing you on the next one. For now, I will say goodbye.